In this video, we are going through 8 charts. Together, they build the complete structural case for why one company, sitting at the center of global commerce, has quietly become one of the most defensible businesses ever constructed. Welcome to the channel, where we break down investing using clear, data-driven charts to track where institutional money is moving and what that means for your portfolio. Everything here is structural analysis drawn directly from the data. What you do with it is entirely your decision. Most people carry a Visa card. Almost none of them understand the business behind it. The first chart breaks that open, and the revenue structure is not what most investors expect. Look at the left axis, revenue in billions of dollars. 3 years of data, 4 color-coded segments stacked in each bar. Blue for service revenue, purple for data processing, green for international transactions, and yellow for other revenue. Then, a separate pink bar showing client incentives, the amount Visa pays back to banks and partners. The diamond marks net revenue. Here is what this chart proves. None of those 4 revenue streams involve lending, not one. Visa earns fees on the act of moving money, not on whether anyone pays it back. Service revenue and data processing together represent over half of gross revenue in every single year shown. Net revenue reached $40 billion in the most recent fiscal year shown, after paying back $15.8 billion in incentives. That deduction is real, but so is the $40 billion that remains. This is not a bank, it is a toll road, and the toll is collected on every single transaction. The next chart shows exactly how much traffic uses that road. The blue bars represent annual payments volume in trillions. The x-axis spans roughly a decade of data. The green line on the right axis tracks year-over-year growth. Notice the bar highlighted in red near the middle of the chart. That is the year a global pandemic shut down international travel and consumer spending collapsed. Volume that year was flat. Not down, flat. Every other year on this chart shows growth. The most recent bar reaches $14.2 trillion. That is not revenue. That is the raw volume of commerce Visa processes annually, and it earns a fraction of every dollar that moves. The structural insight here is stability. The toll road does not close during a recession. It barely slowed during a pandemic. That is what a network effect looks like from the outside. The next chart asks a sharper question. What does that stability actually produce in margin terms? The blue line tracks Visa's GAAP operating margin across more than a decade of data. The orange horizontal line is the financial sector median, around 25%. The white line is the S&P 500 median, around 12%. Visa's line never once touches either benchmark. It never drops below 60%. In most years, it sits between 63 and 67%. The most recent data point shows 60%, and there's a footnote on that chart worth reading. A $2.5 billion litigation provision pulled that number down artificially. Strip that out, and the structural margin is unchanged. Think about what this means. For every dollar of net revenue, Visa keeps more than 60 cents as operating profit, year after year, across multiple economic cycles. The financial sector median is 25%. Visa runs at more than double that, consistently. This level of margin persistence does not come from cost cutting. It comes from architecture. The next chart reveals the architectural decision that makes all of it possible. 3 bars, 3 companies, 1 y-axis measuring provision for credit losses, money set aside to cover loans that won't be repaid. Visa's bar is labeled $0. American Express, $5.3 billion. JP Morgan Chase, $14.2 billion. Visa, 0. Every year. This is not a good quarter. This is not a favorable credit cycle. This is a structural design choice. Visa does not lend money. The credit risk sits entirely with the issuing bank, Chase, Citi, Bank of America. When a cardholder defaults, Visa feels nothing. The bank absorbs the loss. That single design decision is the reason Chart 3 looks the way it does. You cannot lose money on loans you never made. And it raises the next structural question. If the U.S. network is this efficient, how much larger could this model get globally? The next chart answers that directly. This is a horizontal bar chart. Each bar represents a region. The x-axis measures the share of consumer transactions still made in cash. Read from bottom to top, North America at 10%, Europe at 18%, Asia Pacific at 15%, Latin America at 27%, and Africa and the Middle East at 40%, labeled on the chart as the biggest runway. The U.S. market is mature. That is not a surprise. What most investors miss is that Visa's addressable market is not the U.S. market. The growth story is in regions where 4 out of every 10 consumer transactions still happen in cash, and digital infrastructure is expanding faster than most analysts model. Every percentage point of cash that converts to digital flows over a network. Visa's network. The structural tailwind here is not quarterly, it is generational, and the financial profile of that tailwind becomes visible in the next chart. Blue bars show annual free cash flow across roughly a decade of data. The orange line tracks capital expenditure as a percentage of free cash flow, red on the right axis. The most recent bar reaches $21.6 billion in free cash flow. The orange line, CapEx as a share of that, stays between 5% and 8% across the entire period. It barely moves. Free cash flow tripled over the period shown. CapEx intensity did not rise with it. This is what a capital-light model looks like in practice. The network is already built. Incremental volume costs almost nothing to process. Every additional dollar of payment volume generates incremental margin at nearly zero additional cost. That is the economics of a toll road, not a construction company. If you are finding this level of institutional-grade analysis useful, this channel breaks down quality businesses using the same data-driven framework every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Follow us on social for more on long-term investing, institutional capital flows, and financial independence. The handle is in the description. The next chart explains why replicating this model is effectively impossible. This is not a data chart, it is a structural diagram. 2 panels connected by arrows through a central hub labeled VisaNet. On the left, cardholders, 4.9 billion payment credentials, and issuers, 14,500 financial institutions. On the right, 175 million merchant locations across 220-plus countries and 3,000-plus acquiring institutions. At the bottom, 5 metrics. $16.7 trillion total volume, 329 billion annual transactions, 83,000 transactions per second peak capacity, 99.99999% uptime, and 220-plus countries. The arrows tell the story. More cardholders create more network value. More network value attracts more merchants. More merchant acceptance creates greater utility for cardholders. More cardholders attract more issuers. The loop compounds. It has been compounding for decades. The 52.2% global credit card market share figure at the bottom right is the outcome of that compounding. Building a competing network requires simultaneously convincing billions of cardholders and hundreds of millions of merchants to switch at the same time. No one has done it. The structure makes it nearly rational not to try. That brings us to the payoff chart, and what a decade of this architecture has actually returned. 3 lines, indexed to 100 at the start, spanning roughly a decade of data. Blue is Visa, gold is the S&P 500, and green is the S&P 500 Financials Index. The right side labels tell you everything. Visa at plus 466%, the S&P 500 at plus 304%, and the financial sector at plus 225%. Visa's blue line separates early and never looks back. Notice the dip roughly 2/3 through the chart. That's the pandemic year, the flat volume year from chart 2. The line pauses, then accelerates. Every structural advantage documented in the previous 7 charts produced this divergence. The financial sector, the category most investors would place Visa in, returned less than half of what Visa returned over the same period. Because Visa is not a financial company in any traditional sense. It's infrastructure, priced like a financial, structured like a monopoly. This is structural analysis only, not investment advice. But the data across these 8 charts points to one conclusion that is not cycle-dependent. Businesses that earn on the flow of commerce without owning the risk tend to compound at rates that are structurally difficult to disrupt. Visa has done it for a decade. The architecture that produced that decade is still in place. The question worth sitting with is this. In a world where global commerce is still converting from cash to digital, how much of the toll road has actually been built yet? If you found this content valuable, subscribe and like this video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next one.